Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, The End of Jobs, How to Prepare Your Career for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, presented by Jeff Wald, author of The End of Jobs, The Rise of On-Demand Workers and Agile Corporations. My name is Mara. I'm the content manager at Ivy Exec, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in this session by asking questions to our presenter, which you can do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll address questions at the end. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now I would like to introduce you to today's presenter. Jeff Wald holds an MBA from Harvard University and an MS and BS from Cornell University. He began his career in finance and is the founder of several technology companies, including WorkMarket, an enterprise software platform that enables companies to manage freelancers, which was acquired by ADP. He is an active angel investor and startup advisor, as well as serving on numerous public and private boards of directors. Jeff is the author of The Birthday Rules and The End of Jobs, The Rise of On-Demand Workers and Agile Corporations, and he frequently speaks at conferences and in media on startups and labor issues. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Jeff. All yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for attending. We're going to talk a little bit about the future of work. The information we're going to go through is based on all the research I did for the book. The book was released 2 months ago today, actually. And it's been amazing. We hit #1 on all of Amazon's HR categories for a little while. You guys can all go and buy the book on Amazon right now. I won't say anything important for the next few minutes. You can just go right there right now and buy it. But today we're going to go through the history of work, a little bit about the world of work today, some near-term predictions and some long-term predictions, but I am here for you. So feel free to ask questions. I think we're going to do, about 25 minutes of presentation and then we'll jump into the Q&A, but anything you guys want to know about the future of work, the world of work and things like that, if there's anything I can answer, I will certainly do my best, and I'm here to serve you, so you tell me what it is you'd like to know. And again, thank you for taking time out of your day for being here with us. So with that, we're going to dive right in. Here are the key takeaways. Now, these are not all the key takeaways from the book, because given the length of time we have, I had to truncate the presentation, but we want to talk a lot about the previous step functions of technological change, mechanization, electrification, and computerization, and how companies and workers interacted when these huge new productivity increases came into the market. We're going to talk about the movement of one office, one manager, 9 to 5 as the context of a job, to this fluid, team-based, always-on work from anywhere job. We're going to talk a little bit about on-demand labor and how it is not new and it is not the future of work, but we will talk about how on-demand labor is permeating the full-time workforce and what that means. Then obviously we're going to talk a lot about robots and AI, and specifically how I am predicting no net job losses, but how retraining will become vitally important. We're also going to do a few trivia questions through this. You can find me on Twitter at Jeffrey Wald, JEFFREYWALD, and the first person to tweet and follow with the correct answer to the trivia questions will get a signed copy of the book sent to them in the next few weeks. So we'll probably do 2 or 3 of those trivia questions. So have your Twitter out and ready. Follow me now so you can be the first to answer those questions. So first we're going to do is study the past. So in the book, we do a long and deep dive into the rise of companies and the factory system and regulation and all these other things. Today, we'll just talk about the framework, which is this idea of a balance of power between companies and workers. The factory system, the allocation of capital and technology, and the ability to automate and get productivity increases increase the power of companies. And then workers have regulation, the social safety net, and unions that help them get their power. And what we see through the history of work is this undulating power balance between companies and workers. And you see massive movements when there are huge movements in technological change, such as what people refer to as the three industrial revolutions. Mechanization, where we moved from hand power or sometimes animal power to machine power. I think people remember the first industrial revolution and the cotton gin and the spinning jenny and the weaving loom massively transforming textiles first and foremost. That moved into electrification, the flowing of power into those machines. And then our last industrial revolution was the age of computerization, which created an entire digital world and was the first step in automation. We'll talk through all of those things in a moment. But every time these technologies came on stream, you had huge productivity increases. I mean, in the factor of 1,000-fold, the difference between a person picking cotton, turning the cotton into thread, weaving the thread into cloth, and then making a piece of clothing versus a automated picking mechanism, a spinning cotton gin, a spinning jenny into a weaving loom, was about 1,000x increase in productivity. And every time you see those kinds of increases in productivity, people start getting concerned, saying, oh my gosh, there's never going to be a need for human labor again. And every time they are incorrect. Each of these industrial revolutions saw power massively shift to companies. Workers get totally abused, and people remember things from school like the Triangle Factory Fire or the Pullman strike. You may not remember the Battle of Blair Mountain or the Ludlow Massacre, but given how they're given their names, you can guess how they turned out for workers. And as workers are abused, you see regulation, the social safety net, and unions help bring a somewhat balance back in that relationship. But then a new technological revolution comes and workers have to fight again. And again, each time there is this concern that there will be no more need for workers, that companies are going to become monolithic and take over, and it's going to be a dystopian future. And every time we end up with more jobs and an ever higher standard of living with people working fewer hours. That has been the very clear data patterns that have occurred through the history of work. And it becomes very important to study this power dynamic between the two, the things that comprise that power dynamic, and the data patterns and trends that persist, because we sit on the precipice of the fourth industrial revolution, robots and AI. And as robots and AI give huge amounts of bargaining power because of huge productivity increases, how are workers going to respond? Those are things that become very important to study because the world of work today is evolving very rapidly. So let's dive into a little bit of the world of work today. This is the transformation that is guiding most of the world of work today. This one boss, one office, 9-to-5 job is dying. It is moving slowly to the fluid, team-based, work from anywhere, always on job. And we'll talk a lot about what that means for companies and for workers, and we certainly dive very deep into it in the book. One of the things that we spent a lot of time on, as Mara mentioned, I ran a company called Work Market. We built it up, sold it 2 years ago to ADP, the world's largest human capital management software provider. And Work Market is enterprise software that enables corporations to manage their on-demand labor. And so for 10 years, this was everything I focused on, the on-demand labor markets. And there were a lot of myths about the on-demand labor market. One, that Uber or the Uberization of work was the future. First of all, Uberization is not a word, but people keep using it. People think that all new jobs over the last 10 years, current situation notwithstanding, were on-demand jobs. Not correct. And there were all kinds of predictions. I remember when I started Work Market, there was a huge prediction that 50% of the labor force would become on demand by 2020. It is 2020 and 50% of the labor force is not on demand. That prediction was never remotely feasible. On demand has been 25 to 30% of the labor force for generations. It is a very, very large part of the labor landscape, and it has been around since well before the beginning of the second industrial revolution. These were very, very important parts of the labor force. When we look at all the different studies that measure the on-demand labor force over the last 10 years, which is when we have the most data, you get a basic picture that either the on-demand labor market has grown a little bit, which the Upwork study, which is about an 8-year study where they do a survey each year, grown a little bit. You can look at a company called MBO Partners, which has been doing the same survey for 10 years, and they would say it's about the same size. Or you can look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the U.S. Department of Labor's Research Institute, and they would say that it's shrunk, that it's actually gotten a little smaller over the last 15 years. And so all of that, based with the research from the ADP Research Institute, would show that there has been a very slow and steady increase of the on-demand labor market over the next 10 years. And there's a lot of conversation about where that market will go, which we can maybe get into later. Here are things that we need to talk about given what's going on in the world today. Here's what we know. The unemployment rate in the United States is actually about 20%. I appreciate the headline statistic was 13.5 dropping to 11 and change. That is what is known as is one measure of the labor force. What we like to look at is what's known as the U6 measure of unemployment, which is a much broader definition of unemployment, or the labor force participation rate, which is just the broadest measure, which is everybody that can be working in the denominator, or everybody that is working in the numerator. And from that, we get about 20% of the US workforce is currently unemployed. We have about 40% of the US workforce at its peak during the pandemic that was working from home. It's important to note that the maximum that can work from home in the United States is 42%. That is the largest of all countries in the world of a population that can work from home. Obviously, there are certain jobs that cannot be done from home, whether it's retail or entertainment or leisure or manufacturing or transportation. Those jobs simply can't be done from your home. And the United States has the largest percent of their population that can work from home. We have seen PTO and sick days, which would be part of the social safety net, massively get augmented through the CARES Act and other pieces of legislation where companies are being forced to put in place these policies. And we also saw in the CARES Act that unemployment insurance was being made available in the on-demand market for the first time. Those are two very big changes to the social safety net, and they're very important harbingers of how this pandemic may impact the future of work. When people ask me, how is the pandemic impacting the future of work? I generally have two answers. One is, we just don't have the data yet. For those of us that study labor statistics, it's way too early to tell. The data is moving so rapidly, we don't know which changes will become permanent and which won't. That said, we can make the broad generalization about 5 trends that they are speeding up. One is this notion of concentration, the idea that fewer and fewer companies are controlling more and more of economic output. Certainly that is true in the stock market, as 5 companies now represent about 30% of the S&P 500. Deglobalization is speeding up, the idea of decoupling, certainly the US and the Chinese economy, and various other manufacturing processes being brought into home countries. Things like vaccine manufacturer and medicine manufacturer certainly come to mind when you think about a speeding up of a trend of deglobalization because of this pandemic. The on-demand labor market has 2 counterbalancing trends. One is the idea that companies saw in very real time the benefits of on-demand labor, because on-demand labor allows you to flex up and flex down your workforce. And certainly as a pandemic was raging and revenues were collapsing, the ability to very rapidly adjust your costs had a huge appeal to a lot of companies. And that is pushing the on-demand labor market forward at maybe greater rates of adoption that we saw in the past. Counterbalancing that is the regulatory environment for on-demand labor. California at the beginning of this year passed a very, very widely watched law called AB 5, which sought to really redefine what it was to be an employee to be much more broad. And so companies are getting more concerned about the regulatory environment and are starting to convert some of their 1099s to W-2s, on-demand workers to full-time workers. Robotics, again, very early to tell, but the idea that robots don't get sick and robots could have been working this whole time certainly will impact that cost-benefit analysis that companies do as to whether or not to spend the huge amounts of money necessary to displace workers with robots and AI. And then remote work is clearly the most powerful trend that we all have got a chance to see live. We'll talk about that more in a moment, and given our time, we'll skip through the rest of this. But here is remote work. So here's what we knew about remote work prior to the pandemic. We knew, based on a series of studies, Stanford and Google have done the two most exhaustive studies on this, that remote workers were more productive, they were more engaged, they had lower attrition rates, they cost less for the company and cost less for the worker, and the worker themselves was less stressed, they were happier, they were healthier. Everything about that said remote work was good. And yet when I would sit with CEOs of companies and talk about their remote workforce in the context of the future of work, they would all say, yeah, I get all that, but I just think people are more productive when they're in the office. I would say, okay, based on what? They would say, I don't have any data, it's just what I think. And that mindset was an incredibly powerful impediment to more people working remote. The second impediment to that, more people working remote, was policies, procedures, and infrastructure that companies needed to put in place in order to have remote work at scale. Remote work used to be what we call a pull function. It was the employee saying, can I work from home? It was mostly the boss saying, no, you cannot. Either they said no because they had an antiquated mindset that wasn't based on data, or their company didn't have the ability for that person to access the right systems, or they didn't know how to integrate them into meetings and things like that. You need the policies, procedures, and infrastructure. Clearly, the pandemic forced both of those things to change. And so again, at its height, about 40% of the US workforce was working remote. And the prediction that we are making after a lot of research and study, working with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is that about 8% of the workforce will work remotely post-pandemic. God willing, post-pandemic is a time we all see soon, but whenever that comes, we would expect to settle at about 8%. Now, some people, when they hear the 8%, go, oh, that doesn't feel like enough. Everyone loves working from home. Well, everyone doesn't love working from home. Let's start with that. Humans are a social animal. They want to be engaged with more people. And it's important to remember when you think about that 8%, the 42% that can work from home, right? So actually that 8% represents nearly 20% of the workers that could work from home are going to be working from home. So put in that way, it seems much bigger. And also remember, when we talk about work from home, that is a very specific categorization of how somebody works. People with flexible work arrangements may well be 30% of the workforce, where you can work from home every now and again. But if you specifically are categorized as working from home, that is to say, more than 50% of the time, you do not go into an office, which has important implications from a tax standpoint. That's where your tax nexus is established. So that 8% needs to be understood in the context of all those things. This kind of analysis, what we just did here, kind of talking through how companies engage workers, what the data tells us, that is at the heart what this book is about, is to look at data patterns, data trends, to look at historic context, to think about how companies actually engage workers, and to use those to make a thoughtful, high fidelity prediction about the future of work. Because people that make predictions outside of the historic context, outside of the data patterns, outside of how companies work, they tend to make predictions like, oh, 50% of the labor force is going to work on demand. There's no world in which 50% of the workforce works on demand. It is a ridiculous prediction, much like predictions I've heard recently which say, oh, 50% of the US workforce is going to work remotely post-pandemic. And you're like, that's interesting. Only 42% of the workforce can work remotely. So where the heck are you getting that number? Something to be mindful of when you hear people make predictions about the future of work is, what's the historic context, what are the data patterns, and how do companies really engage workers? Because those are what will really drive the future of work. Now, let's do our first trivia question. This dives into data. So again, first person to respond to @JeffreyWald. So people like to talk about the lifetime employment model. And anytime I get into debates, I'm invited to these conferences, and there'll be a debate on on-demand work. Is it good for the worker, bad for the worker? Inevitably, I have to argue that it's good for the worker, given, work market and everything I've done in the on-demand work world of work. And inevitably, the person arguing for or against on-demand labor says, oh, well, it used to be so different. And so the question I'm going to ask you guys is, what is the average length that a person was in a job in 1960? That's the question. First person to tweet at Jeffrey Wald with the correct answer will get a signed copy of the book sent to them. But let's put this in context. It is 4.2 years today. The average person stays in a job for 4.2 years. And everybody harkens back to this time, I guess in like the 1960s, that everybody used to work at their same company for life. They would march towards their gold watch. Just as an aside, Pepsi was the first company to give a gold watch. Said, you gave us your time, now we give you time back. And then that, for some reason, became the standard. So people harken back to this time, but here's the data. The data is in 1960, the average person stayed in a job for 5 years. And so is that to say the lifetime employment contract never existed? No, I'm not saying that. Did it exist for some workers at some companies? Absolutely. But to pretend that that was the standard for every worker in the United States just doesn't bear itself out in the data. For some workers at some companies, they march towards their gold watch. For most workers, the context in which they work is not that different from a tenure standpoint than it is today. And that's important to remember as you think about the future of work and you think about the past. But we should talk a little bit about the future of work. In the book, I go through 4 near-term predictions about the future of work. Today, we're just going to talk about one, but we're going to talk about convergence, the second, third, and fourth small movements, the idea that in the labor market, when you look at labor statistics, aside from massive economic dislocation, kind of like what's going on now, labor statistics move very slowly and very steadily. So anytime you hear somebody say, oh, well, it's going to grow 100% over the, just be wary. It's not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying it very rarely happens. Total talent management is the idea of companies managing all of their workers, full-time, part-time, temps, freelancers, vendors, robots, drones, AI systems, all in one plane, and how all that's getting stitched together. That is why ADP bought Work Market. Is ADP helps companies manage their full-time workers. We help people organize, manage, and pay their on-demand workers, and so all of that's being stitched together in ADP systems now. And then alumni labor clouds, the idea that every company will start keeping in much closer touch with their former employees. But let's talk a little bit about convergence. Convergence is actually part of the title, right? The title of the book is The End of Jobs, Rise of On-Demand Workers and Agile Corporations. The total talent management, that is the agile corporation part that we go into a book. This is the rise of on-demand workers. That is not to say that everyone is going to be an Uber driver, far from it. It is to say that all of the things that the Uber driver faces are permeating the full-time workforce, and all workers are starting to be concerned about the same things that the Uber driver faces. The Uber driver faces an individual safety net. They don't have a corporate safety net, a corporate 401k, company paying their health care. It is all on them, and they have limited access to the government safety net. Again, some of that changed with the CARES Act. We'll see how long that persists. But as an on-demand worker or that Uber driver, stay with that example, the Uber driver doesn't get unemployment. Uber driver doesn't get workers' comp. Those are systems that are built around the W-2. And so the Uber driver has an individual safety net. The Uber driver gets their jobs allocated to them, not by a manager, but by an algorithm. Their HR is completely data-driven. It is their rating, and it's actually a host of other functions that you don't know about, but it's not just the rating as to which Uber driver gets the next job. It's how quickly did they complete a task, how quickly did they respond when asked if they wanted a job, and a host of things. On Work Market, we actually capture 127 data points on every interaction between a company and a worker. Their work is task-based, right? Pick up Jeff, take Jeff to the airport. Well, not to the airport anymore, but usually to the airport. And that is the entirety of the work, right? It is a very discrete task for which they are paid. They clearly work from anywhere, and they are obviously always on. There's no time clock that you punch in and out of. You just decide, oh, I want to do some jobs, so I'm going to do some jobs. Those things, again, are permeating the full-time workforce. The corporate safety net is shrinking. Companies don't provide as much training and development. The defined benefit pension plan became the defined contribution pension plan, became the 401k. Companies are moving away from annual reviews to more data-based weekly check-ins with employers and between employers and employees. Work is being atomized from very broad statements down to tasks. Companies increasingly are allowing their workers to work from home. Obviously, the pandemic massively increased that. And I don't think anybody on the phone thinks that they work a 9-to-5 job anymore. So the full-time worker is slowly inching towards that on-demand worker, and that is what I mean in the subtitle of the book, Rise of On-Demand Workers. But let's get to everyone's favorite topic, which of course is the robots and AI. So our favorite quote of all the quotes we've seen thus far, Judgment Day is inevitable. So let's talk a little bit about this thing, the robots. So robots started coming on to the world of work in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and industrial manufacturing, very heavy manufacturing, automotive manufacturing is the most well-known. And they basically were arms coming off of a pole. And those arms could do three things. They could paint, they could weld, and they could pick something up. And that was enough. That was enough to begin a massive displacement of workers in United States manufacturing. US manufacturing peaked at 20 million workers in 1980. It has had a slow and steady decline, and about 90% of that decline is attributed to these robots. It is not trade policy, it is not environmental policy. We actually produce massively more stuff, almost twice as much industrial output comes out of the United States as it did in 1980. We just do it with far fewer workers. 20 million was the peak, and it settled around 12 million about 25 years later, and it stayed at about 12 million. Again, COVID notwithstanding, we don't have a lot of data yet as to what's happening there. So those were the first robots. But the robot population on the Earth today is about 17 million. There are about 17 million robots on the planet. 15 million of them are vacuum cleaners. That's the population of robots. There are 2.1 million industrial robots that are in manufacturing, from heavy manufacturing now down to assembly. And it's growing about 10 to 15% a year, the 2.1 million. That is the robots that potentially displace workers, but we have a lot of data that says they're displacing them in some places and adding them in others, but we'll see how it all plays out. And then AI is very interesting in as much as this is the third dawn of AI. AI had two false dawns where people felt that there was going to be this huge thing that was going to displace workers. And there's a lot of discussion going on right now as to whether or not AI is, again, being overblown and cannot live up to what it is doing or saying that it can do. I am actually more, not excited, because that's not the right word, but I am more confident in AI's ability to break through and become a wide-ranged application today than in the previous two dawns. But you are already starting to see investment in AI massively curtail. As you know, there was a huge frenzy and everybody invested and tried to build a bunch of things. And you're seeing companies starting to pull back their investments in robotic process automation software, the ability for AI to do mundane tasks. That being said, it will still have a huge impact, but this is kind of the beginning of that counter wave that you normally see of people saying, oh my God, it's gonna be the greatest thing. And then, well, it doesn't really live up to the hype, but then we'll get back to a counter to the counter wave at some point. So those are the robots. And when we look at how robots might displace work, we need to look at the data. We can break work down into about 704 different job categories. Each of those job categories has a series of component tasks. Whatever percentage of those component tasks that are repetitive high volume tasks are the ones that get automated. Anytime you hear the word repetitive high volume task, know that eventually that task will get automated. You start to look at those 704 jobs and you look for the jobs that have 50% or more of their component tasks are repetitive high volume tasks. Those jobs are at high risk of being automated over the next 20 years. But when you start to break down how many of those jobs there are, how many people are employed in those jobs, and then when it's 50% to 75%, you think about job degradation, meaning there were 4 people that performed that task. Now with the new AI software helping us, we only need 2, versus jobs that are 75% to 100% of their component tasks. You start to think, well, we had 4% of those people, we need none. Or we had 4 people doing that task, we need none now. So when you start to look at that data and crunch those numbers, you get to 10 to 15% of jobs will be lost over the next 20 years to robots and AI. That is a far cry from reports you guys may have seen headlines of. McKinsey reports 50% of jobs are going to go. Oxford University reports 47% of jobs are going to go. PricewaterhouseCoopers. I mean, I've read all these studies and I've seen the headlines, and what happens, of course, is you see the headline gets blasted about, and everyone sees it and reacts to it and does the same thing that people did in the first 3 industrial revolutions. Oh my God, all the jobs are going to go. When you actually look at those reports and read through them, you'll see that that's not what they're saying. They are getting closer to this 10 to 15% of jobs that are going to be lost. About 5 to 10% of jobs will be gained in areas that are either growing, whether it's software, robots, data, AI. Those jobs obviously are growing tremendously, but also things that require creativity and human connection. So HR, sales, and marketing, and a host of other jobs are expected to grow. To stay on the jobs, by the way, that get lost, those are things like transportation, retail, data entry, administrative functions. Those jobs are at a high risk of going over the next 20 years. And then here's the part that almost always gets left out in the analysis, is that there are always jobs created that we just didn't think about. We just didn't know that that was going to be a job. Who knew that social media marketing manager was a job? And yet there are 100,000 people employed as social media marketing managers in the United States now. And so there will be new jobs created, and all of this math yields that we will not have a net job loss. But that is not to say that we will not have job losses. We'll have tremendous job losses. And here's what happens every time in these industrial revolutions. Jobs are lost in certain industries, whether it was agriculture in the first and textiles in the first industrial revolution, all the way through to manufacturing in the third industrial revolution. But society creates more jobs, as it did each time. But what society does a terrible job of is retraining workers to move from the jobs that are dying to the jobs that are growing. And every time people look back and they say, oh, well, we ended up with more jobs and ever greater standard of living, so it'll all be fine. And that's true, we did. But it's important to note that getting from point A to point B was a tremendous dislocation for society. You're talking about literally blood in the streets, revolutions in Europe, huge dislocations in the United States. So to pretend that just because eventually we will end up in a better place, therefore we don't need to worry about it, would be tremendously foolish. Because each time the people that lose their jobs are very disaffected, and it leads to rises of nationalism and populism and a host of other things that are tremendous net negatives, because society did a really terrible job of providing the retraining necessary so that they could move to those jobs. And so when people talk about the doom of Skynet, which is the term everybody gives to robots taking all of our jobs, I'll say, look, the doom of Skynet is not robots taking our jobs. The doom of Skynet is the exacerbation of existing gaps in society, because we didn't do the work necessary to provide the retraining necessary to workers all across the economic spectrum. And if we do that, we will end up in a much better place much quicker. Now, that said, we should think about our 3 counterbalancing forces as we think about this 4th industrial revolution. And it's not a great picture for them. The union movement in the United States is at its lowest point in 100+ years in terms of percent of the workforce that is enrolled in a union. More on that in a second. The regulatory environment, the current administration massively rolling it back, some states stepping up, like California with the AB5 law, into that breach, But the regulatory state, for the most part, is being really, really rolled back. And the social safety net is at its closest to insolvency that it's ever been. And so those are not great omens for workers as you think about this fourth industrial revolution. However, one of the things to think about in regards to the union movement is something like the Fight for 15. Now, the Fight for 15 started out of the SEIU, Service Employee International's Union in Seattle, and it became a grassroots activist movement by mostly non-union members that has led 27 different states to start on a path. No state is yet at a $15 minimum wage. Some cities are, but they are starting slowly towards a path towards a $15 minimum wage. The federal minimum wage, by the way, is still $7.25 an hour, which is to say about $15,000 a year for a worker. Think about how someone could subsist on $15,000 a year. But this new movement, the Fight for 15, is a harbinger of a new type of union movement that is not someone paying union dues, but it is workers uniting in common cause to move forward things that are helping them to get some power back in that relationship. Now let's move to our next trivia question. The trivia question is going to be, how many bank tellers are employed in the United States today? There were 500,000 bank tellers in the United States in 1995. Again, first person to tweet at Jeffrey Wald with the correct answer, get a signed copy of the book. 500,000 bank tellers in the United States in 1995. In 1995 also happened to be the year at which the ATM was then in every single bank in the United States. The ATM was invented on September 2nd, 1969, Rockville Centre, New York, Chemical Bank, put the first ATM in place. And when the ATM came out in 1995, what do you think everyone predicted about bank teller employment in the United States? Oh my God, the machines are taking over. There'll be no bank teller jobs in the United States because the machine performs the repetitive, high volume task, taking money in, giving money out, that a teller performs. Therefore, we will not need tellers anymore in the United States. Okay, maybe. But when you look at a bank teller's job, it's not entirely taking money in and taking money out. Again, the 704 job categories, what are the component tasks of the job? Bank teller is one of those jobs. Component tasks, about 45% taking money in, giving money out. So bank tellers actually now can come out from behind the bulletproof glass. They can have an iPad. They could be doing better customer service. Hi, welcome to Chase. How can I help you today? Not you just standing in a line before you finally get to talk to somebody at a teller window. They can say, oh, we can, cross-sell you with a mortgage product. Have you considered a mortgage product or an automotive loan or an investment product? They can do customer service, upselling, and higher volume, higher value tasks for their company. So what's interesting is that the average amount of tellers per branch in the United States over this 25-year period that we're talking about did decrease. It went from 21 to 13 average tellers per branch. But the number of bank branches in the United States doubled. And so the number of tellers employed in the United States increased 20%. There are 600,000 bank tellers employed in the United States today. And so people that look at that say, oh, this is a great example of cobots. Cobots being the worker works alongside the robot does the mundane high volume tasks, the worker can focus on higher value tasks. And you say, maybe, because the biggest variable in the equation on bank teller employment in the United States was the banking deregulation that allowed for bank branches to massively increase their footprints. That was the biggest variable in the equation. And it shows that any simple conclusion that anybody gives you about the future of work, oh, because, robots can carry stuff, there'll be no more workers in Amazon's warehouses. Okay, maybe. But any simple explanation belays the massive complexity that goes into what companies do when they think about their workforces. We talk in the book about what we call the labor equation, the very complex system of equations that companies use to think about, do I want full-time workers, part-time workers, temps, freelancers, robots, drones, AI systems to perform this work? And it takes into account things like cost, of course, takes into account cost, but cost is one variable. Takes into account the intellectual property, customer touch points, the competitive dynamic, the complexity of the situation, the ramp up time, the length of the job, the regulatory environment, and a host of other things. And so anybody that just has a simple explanation that says, oh, because of this, then that, just be wary and think about where it is that companies actually engage workers, think about the historic context, and think about the data patterns. And so with that, while I will say we cannot predict the future, because predicting the future is very, very hard, I will say we do get to create it. You know, all the people on this call have very important positions at companies all over the world. You get to determine what the future of work is, what the retraining is. We all get to choose the men and women that represent us and are determining the laws that involve the regulatory system. They're determining what we want the social safety net to be. If we determine that retraining is mandatory for every single company that lets go a worker, then that is what will happen in the United States. So we don't know, the future is difficult to predict, but we and all of you can create it. So with that, I will go back to Mara and say, Mara, thank you again. And everyone, thank you again for having me. And let's do some questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for all of that thought-provoking information and putting data in perspective. We've got some great questions, and I'll just remind everyone that if you have a question, you can submit it in the question box. So one of the questions that came up was, what are the skills and experience that corporations are going to be looking for when they're looking to hire the kind of talent that they need these days?
So one of the things I didn't get into was the Future of Work Prize, which is a part of the book. It's the second half of the book. First half is everything we kind of went through with deep dives on a bunch of things and some things that I left out. The second half is the Future of Work Prize, which is a $10 million prize that I am putting up. And I had the 20 leading thinkers and shapers of the future of work write their essay on what they think the world of work looks like in 2040. And someone will be selected the winner, and that's the Future of Work Prize. In doing the Future of Work Prize and selecting those 20 people to submit in for the book, I probably spoke to hundreds of CHROs and CEOs, people that are the head of the union movement and people leading the educational environment in terms of preparing people for work. And I would always ask them some semblance of this question. You know, the question I would actually ask was, what advice would you give to someone just starting out their career? And I will tell you, their answer was actually almost always the same. I'm going to paraphrase it down into something not that elegant, but they basically said, you need to be prepared for constant change. You need to be a lifelong learner, because the rate at which skills diminish is increasing. It used to be from 18 to 22, the majority of people would learn the majority of skills they needed for the next 30 to 40 years that they could monetize in a career. That is not the case anymore. Skills abate in anywhere between 3 and 5 years now. And so everything that you learn 5 years from now, from a technical standpoint, will be mostly not useless, but very difficult to monetize. And so people that are capable of generating their own learning, because again, companies are taking this step back. It used to be companies would send you to, you know, IBM University if you worked at IBM for 2 weeks a year. IBM University was closed. And now at IBM, you have to do 40 hours of online training on your own time to increase your own skills. And so companies are pushing this onto workers. So as a manager, you're looking for workers that are stepping forward and saying, I'm going to take this online class. Maybe the company will, you know, subsidize it. I want to learn these new skills, and I am very adaptable and can work in different types of environments, whether it's work from home or team-based and things like that. So I think about lifelong learning, one. I think about the fact that work is moving to this fluid team-based model, and people that are incapable of working in teams are going to be at a huge disadvantage because everything is increasingly team-based. And I think about the creativity, design, empathy type things that drive a lot of the job growth over the next 20 years, because they're things that AI and robots simply cannot do. And so those are things I think about.
Thank you. That actually covered a couple of questions that we've gotten, so that was great. One person has asked, there's a push and pull between the working population aging and these new technology skills. Do you see ageism in the workforce continuing to be a problem? Will it subside as the workforce gets older, increase as technology advances? What do you
That is a great question. So demographics are a huge issue in the world of work. Actually, my longer presentation have a slide on this. But the United States labor force is alone in the industrial world in that it is predicted to grow. Almost every other labor force, Japan's labor force is shrinking, China's labor force is shrinking, Germany's, France, Italy, they're all shrinking because people are getting older and retiring. And we have not enough workers and people going through the education system to replace them. The United States was different for two reasons. One, the birth rate in the United States was higher than in Europe and in developed Asia. And two, the United States had a higher percentage of immigrants coming into the country, and immigrants tend to be younger and at working age. Both of those things have reversed. So over the last 3 to 4 years, the birth rate in the United States has massively dropped, and immigration also has been massively curtailed. This is all obviously pre-COVID. So how is that going to impact the US labor force? It is unknown. There is not a single study that says anything other than immigrants are massively wonderful for the workforce in a host of ways. So anybody that sits there and goes, oh, immigrants take US jobs, I would say, okay, that's an interesting point of view. Point me the data, because there's no data to support that point of view. But that I've seen, I should say. There may well be data. So as workers age, I would go back to this idea of skills abatement, and I don't know that people are overly concerned about age, especially in the context of algorithms allocating work. What they want to know is, are you capable of performing those tasks? Do you have the skills? Do you have the knowledge, certifications, licenses, whatever it is, to perform the task? Of the billions of dollars of work sent through Work Market, I have the slightest idea how old anybody is, the age of anybody on the Work Market platform. I'm obviously not allowed to ask that question. My algorithms do know what type of work you've performed before, what your certifications you have, what trainings you have. There is a training management system within the Work Market platform, so you can go and take skills assessment tests on a bunch of things to show me what you know. That's not to say the algorithm doesn't have bias. Obviously, there is bias in the institution. There's institutionalized bias, and as much as people that have the opportunity to get those trainings and to get that type of skills, to get those types of jobs, then get more of those jobs. And there are a host of other ways the algorithms have bias, but is at least somewhat better than what a manager might do, bringing their own either unconscious or very conscious bias to an ageist situation. So it is something that I think is going to be interesting as companies look to push retirement ages, as societies need to push retirement ages, because societies cannot afford the number of people that will go on to the different social safety net programs, Medicare and Social Security. And so we as a society need to be pushing the age up, because the age at which people are still able to work is increasing, but we're not increasing the retirement age, and at some point that has to change. So anyway, meandering answer, but hopefully I hit some of what your question was asking.
Yeah, very, very interesting and very pressing issue as well. A couple of people have asked about, you spoke about retraining. So for people who, whether due to pandemic or otherwise, are looking to gain new skills, possibly pivot and change their careers even late in the game, we've had a couple of questions about how do you go from being retrained or choosing what to retrain in into actually becoming employed and proving that you have these skills if you don't have the experience?
It's a really good question. It's actually, to go back to Work Market, that N+1 user that joins Work Market, we don't know much about them. And as a company, if I'm sending a job and I see a new profile that maybe has all the skills and the trainings and they passed all the tests, and I see a profile of someone that's done 783 jobs, which one am I going to select? Or which one is the algorithm going to select? It's going to select this person that's done 783 jobs. I know a lot more about that person. So how does this person get started? We always struggle with that you want to give them some advantage to see what their skills are. Here's what I'll say about training. There are a lot of amazing technologies that come to mind. There's a company I'm involved with called Transfer VR, which uses VR training in a very behavior adaptive protocol, meaning you're performing the task in the VR system. If you perform it incorrectly, it is correcting you in real time. It is understanding that if you perform that task incorrectly, you maybe didn't have some fundamental skills, so it brings you back to the beginning. We need to get the building blocks. Now you'll know how to do this task. And they are killing it. I mean, just absolutely blowing up. Huge global defense contractor brought them in, did a test. 96 people went through the training. They went through the training in like a tenth of the time for a tenth of the cost, and 95 of them were able to start work and just go right in and get on the line. And 6 months later, 89 of them are still there. Those are mind-blowing numbers in the job skills training market. Right? It is mind-blowing that a company is capable of training workers so effectively, so cost-effectively, that the workers are able to immediately start, and 6 months later, the vast majority are still there. It's amazing. And so there are amazing things coming on stream, but it's to be determined where this burden lies. Is it the companies? Should the global defense contractor be doing this type of skills training? These are basic math skills and a host of other things that were necessary to go onto the manufacturing line that the education system didn't provide these people. Is it the company's responsibility? Is it the education system? Should every single high school be having these tracks, and community colleges and trade schools be doing this? And they should be the ones training? Should their trainings adapt? Is it the individual's responsibility? Does the individual go and purchase a Transfer VR kit on their own and do their own training? We don't know how this is going to evolve, and it may well be all three need to own this, because this has to happen, and it has to happen at a scale at which it's never happened before, this retraining. Otherwise, we're in for a society that has way too many gaps, and history would tell us that people that are being left behind don't sit down quietly and just get left behind. They get very upset, as well they should.
Absolutely. So we have time for a couple more questions. So one person has asked if you have been looking at the trends of job loss in terms of company behavior, are they more tending to rehire and retrain existing employees, or are they turning more to hiring new employees, either on demand or otherwise, who already have the skills they want?
Well, two things come out of that question. One, the idea that you would let go a worker, then re-engage them as on demand is actually incredibly rare. I will tell you, as the person running the largest piece of software that manages on-demand workers, I certainly in that role had an incentive for every company to move their workers to on-demand. And I will tell you, in the thousands of sales meetings that I had for Work Market, never once, literally not even one time, did I hear somebody say, hey, we want to change our W-2s to 1099s or to temps. I've never heard anybody say that. I have heard many times people say, the regulatory environment's making me very uncomfortable, and so I'm going to convert all my 1099s to W-2s. I feel uncomfortable that I'm going to get hit with a fine and whatever. That I hear a lot, like hundreds of times I've heard that. So it's important to understand that companies don't just shift their workers from classification to classification. That said, when I talked about one of my near-term predictions were alumni labor clouds, the math on a company staying in touch with its former workers, whether they're furloughed workers because of this horrible situation that we're in, or people that they had to let go, whether it's a normal economic cycle, this economic cycle, the math on bringing them back it is 1/10 the cost to bring back a former worker when you add in recruiting costs, onboarding costs, training costs, retention costs. 1/10 as expensive to bring back a former worker, so companies always opt to do it, but very few companies have the systems to remember who used to work with them. They don't stay in touch. And that, I think, is going to be a huge shift in the human capital management software world, that you'll use a piece of software not only to manage your existing workers, but to manage all the workers that used to work with you. There are about 50,000 companies in the world that are large enough that they could manage an alumni program of some sort. About 350 companies in the world do it today. And so that, to me, is something that will definitively change over the next 10 years.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. So these are two questions that I think go together nicely. One person asked, with the rise in focus on productivity, how do you demarcate better the line between personal and work hours, especially working from home? Another person has asked, do you see a more prominent trend in the future of the 4-hour, 6-hour work week? So there are these two kinds of opposing ideas that are taking prominence. So what do you see for the future of hours?
So, in regards to hours and in regards to personal time versus business time, the always on component of our new job, right? The one boss, one boss, one office, 9 to 5 job, moving to the fluid team-based work from anywhere always on job. That always on component means always on. And so I don't think there's anybody on the call that thinks to themselves, oh, well, at 5 o'clock, I turn my phone off and anyone that emails me as something from work can wait until the morning. We just don't do it anymore. And I think that ship has sailed. I don't know that there's a world you get that back. I think people will establish boundaries, and certainly the more bargaining power you have at your company, you can establish those boundaries. But it's just become too common, and it'll become all the more common as technology continues to permeate. So I think that ship has sailed. That said, I think companies are engaging wellness more and more, and I think understand the benefits of staying out of their employees' personal lives and giving them work. And I think that technology might enable that in some way, but to be determined. Here's what we do know, right? That is all conjecture on the personal versus work-life balance. That's conjecture. We have some data, some patterns, and some things. Here's what we know definitively. The number of hours worked per person has continuously and slowly declined through the history of work. When you look at the 3 industrial revolutions, one chart that is painfully clear and painfully consistent is this slow and steady decline in the number of hours worked. People think the average number of hours worked by a person is 2,000. That's what everybody says, right? 40 hours times 50 weeks, 2,000 hours. The average person in the United States works 1,780 hours. The average person in Germany works 1,450 hours. The average person in Mexico, by the way, works 2,200 hours. And so depending where you are on the industrialization of your economy, depending on where you are with those counterbalancing forces, we can all think of Germany and France as companies with stronger unions, stronger regulatory environments, stronger safety nets. You see the number of hours worked continue to decline. So there is no reason to believe that the number of hours worked will not continue to decline. They declined about 10% over the last 40 years, and they will continue to decline, potentially getting us to the 4-day work week, which has been predicted many, many, many times. It has never come to pass, but it may well come to pass over the next 20 years because the number of hours that we will work to achieve an ever higher standard of living, by the way. I mean, what we can pay for now with 1,780 hours of work is massively better than what someone could achieve with 2,200 hours of work 50 years ago. I mean, it's not even comparable. But the number of hours worked will continue a slow and steady decline.
Thank you. Very, very interesting and different way of thinking about it that makes sense. Well, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Jeff, for this very interesting and wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and just a reminder, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar in the next couple of days. So thank you, and hope everyone has a great day.
Stay safe, be well, Mara, and everyone at Ivy Exec, thank you so much.
All right.